I'm Fonzo.
And I'm Eliza.
And we're the co-host of Grown, a podcast from the Moth that shows we're never fully grown.
Growing up feels like a phase that should end at some point, but does it ever really? Whether you're 16 or 26 or 86, you're gonna have to deal with family drama, your body, and the type of person you want to be. So why not put it all out in the open and go through it together?
Join us every other week to deal with cringe, culture, and the courageous efforts of people like you to get grown.
Start listening today. Follow Grown on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
Hi, you've reached the voicemail for Team Embodied. This week, we'd love to hear about your experiences during the postpartum period. Leave us a message.
My name is Kaisha,
Hi,
and I'm calling
this
from
is
Raleigh.
Amanda.
And
Hi,
in
my
June
name's
of last
Taylor.
year, I was blessed to have a
all of
beautiful
your,
baby.
Your body is moving at 100 miles per hour, and your mind can only go so fast to keep up with
By the
it.
time she arrived, my nipples were cracked and bleeding. She helped me figure out how to get a proper latch, and I think that completely
My
saved
theme
me,
for this postpartum has been
and made the
embracing
breastfeeding
the
experience
ambiguity.
possible for
I
me.
am so exhausted, and I'm so grateful.
Do I have PPA? Are my hormones just raging right now?
Postpartum images I had were of these women with voluptuous breasts and just free from a partner.
During my postpartum time, the thing that stands out the most to me is the staggering vulnerability. I remember in the early days and weeks just feeling so raw and broken open emotionally and so directly in touch with the impermanence and fragility and preciousness of life. So when I think of postpartum, I think about my earliest contact with that visceral, vulnerable, shattering, life-affirming love.
It was Christmas Eve 2020, and my sister and I were 2 hours into a 5-hour drive for a family beach trip. Her partner couldn't take the time off, so I was serving as the parenting assist for the journey. The 2-year-old was mostly fine until the 2-month-old lost her marbles. A diaper change, a feeding session, and many lullabies later, things were still total chaos. We went from trying to whack-a-mole outbursts to aiming to find internal zen in an enclosed space with screaming children. After unloading the car and drinking a glass of wine, I got 8 hours of sleep and quiet. My sister, a night of 2-hour sleep stretches in preparation for a day when she did it all over again. This parenting thing is relentless. Yes, it is also beautiful and tender and, as they tell me, indescribable, but that never really get a break feeling, especially in those early months when you're running on almost no sleep and navigating big unknowns about caring for another human being, it can be a lot, and sometimes too much. This is Embodied, our show about sex, relationships, and your health. I'm Anita Rao.
Taking care of the baby for me was the easy part. Dealing with postpartum anxiety, that was challenging AF. My mind would go from 0 to 100 quickly. I would have fears of dropping the baby, fears of her stopping breathing, just erratic fears that doesn't make sense to a normal person who isn't going through postpartum anxiety.
You have to fill out this form at all of your pediatrician appointments and your postpartum appointments, and it asks if your level of anxiety exceeds the situation that you're in. And that's so hard for me to answer. Of course I'm anxious. All of a sudden I have to care for this new person, and I have no idea what I'm doing.
That was listener Kaisha Jennings and our editor Amanda Magnus, just two of the many people we heard from about their postpartum experiences. You're going to hear more stories as we go along, but I'm going to tell you one recurring theme: struggle. Surging hormones, physical exhaustion, and nursing challenges had many new parents feeling the toll on their mental health. Last week, we talked about the physical aspects of the postpartum period. If you didn't catch it, cue it up next to get the full story. But now, it's time to get real about postpartum depression and anxiety, and figure out how to better support parents.
I'm currently 3 months postpartum with my second son. My first time around, I definitely should have seen a therapist. I needed support and help, but in my head, it just I'm not depressed. Oh, I don't need help. And it was rough. This time around, I am fully aware of how much I'm struggling and just the transition from 1 to 2 kids for me. And seeking out help has been really difficult. The lists of people that my midwives and pediatrician gave me, none of them who were postpartum specific accepted insurance. I think they deserve to get paid. I can't afford to do out of pocket.
Your entire pregnancy, you have a bazillion doctor's appointments, but as soon as you give birth, it's kind of like, peace out, good luck. So I've found it really difficult to get the care that I think I need postpartum, and also just not feeling like I matter anymore since I'm no longer carrying a child.
I tried some therapy sessions, but ultimately I trusted my midwives and I started Zoloft. I hadn't been able to bond with my baby, and that really scared me. It took a few months to really feel like myself, but I feel so happy now, and I finally understand when people say you never knew you could love so much.
That was Bibi, Taylor, and Elise. Therapy and medication are some of the essential tools for treating postpartum anxiety and depression. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. To solve a problem, you need to recognize a problem.
After delivery, I remember the first time that they brought him in from the nursery, he started crying, and it felt like there was this fire that just started burning inside of me. And I felt like I wanted to just break out of my skin to escape from it.
That's Adrienne Nieves. She's an artist. She has 3 children, but it was during her second pregnancy and postpartum period that she really started experiencing physical manifestations of her anxiety.
It was a very jarring and disorienting experience, and it was also very confusing to have that type of physical sensation in my body. And it was pretty frequent, and it was usually triggered by kid-related noise, especially if he was crying.
So you were noticing these symptoms, these feelings in your physical body, and you were part of a church community where there were a number of other mothers, and you started to share a little bit about your mental health concerns. What kind of responses did you hear from folks you spoke with?
The majority of the response was silence. At the time, there was even a licensed therapist who was a pastor at the church, and even she didn't pick up on what I was sharing, or, she didn't identify it as a postpartum mental health issue. Any response that I got, it was really rooted in, well, you're just living with the consequences of your actions because you're an unwed single mother with 2 kids, you're partnered with someone who isn't a Christian. Like, my struggles were pretty much framed as a moral failure and, as the justification as to why my life was falling apart.
Adrienne didn't have the resources to diagnose her own issues. Her OBGYN never brought up postpartum depression. Pamphlets in the waiting room mentioned the baby blues, but depicted women looking sad, holding their head in their hands. Not exactly her symptoms. But eventually, she did come across a website with descriptions that sounded more familiar. It's a blog about maternal mental health called Postpartum Progress.
On that website, they had what they call plain mama English guides. Those guides explained just the full range and scope of symptoms that can be experienced, whether it's postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, or even postpartum psychosis. Finding that information and reaching out to Postpartum Progress for help actually got me connected to a postpartum stress center in Pennsylvania. And that was the first phase of my treatment. And then the second phase was after I had pretty much graduated from therapy and was, considered myself to be in recovery from postpartum depression and anxiety, I started to notice that my symptoms actually were not easing up, and that in many ways they were getting worse. And over a course of a couple of months, it really just became unbearable. And I knew that if I didn't get intervention immediately, that I would not want to continue on with my life. I remembered that as a veteran, I could go to the VA hospital, and I went to the website and looked to see if they had a mental health clinic. And they did, and it mentioned that they had walk-in hours. And so I got a sitter for my older son, and I strapped my infant to my chest and got on a bus, went into the mental health clinic at the VA hospital in Philadelphia, met with the intake psychiatrist, and just started just telling him everything that I'd been experiencing during that first year.
Adrienne learned a lot in that intake appointment. The psychiatrist told her that her family and personal history put her at high risk for a mental health condition. He said her intense periods of anxiety and depression growing up were signs that she likely had bipolar II disorder. And importantly, he told her that she wasn't a broken person.
He said, so I'm telling you this because I want you to see that this is not your fault. You didn't create this. It's a convergence of nature and nurture, pretty much amplified by you giving birth. And that felt like such a weight off my shoulders. And I found being diagnosed with a rapid cycling onset of bipolar II to be very relieving, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah, and there's so much in what you just said about acknowledging that there is silence and generational silence around mental health that can impact how you're able to express what you're experiencing and how people receive you. And then that getting a diagnosis is only the beginning of a journey. It doesn't mean everything is solved. It means that there's, there's a lot more to come. And that was true for you. You worked with a number of people, and you eventually had a therapist who really suggested that you work with your hands. You were experiencing some impulses for self-harm, and she knew that you were someone who really liked data and information. So she said, okay, there's data that supports doing things with your hands can help. So tell me about that and what that led to.
My therapist knew that I was very much into the science behind mental health by that point. And she was like, listen, studies have shown that people who create things with their hands or do something constructive with their hands, see an improvement in their mood and in their symptoms. And so that pushed me to try to find something creative to do. And I remembered when I was a kid that I used to use those, really cheap, like rainbow looms that you would get, for Christmas or for your birthdays. And so I grabbed my kids, I went to Walmart, and I was walking around the craft section looking for yarn. And on my way to the yarn, I passed a bunch of like cheap craft paint and brushes and these little canvas boards. And just really on a whim, it was a very fleeting thought and impulse. I just threw some of that stuff in my cart and kept moving to the yarn and the hooks because I was like, I'm going to crochet, even though I cannot stand tedious things. And so crocheting and knitting is very tedious to me. So needless to say, my experience with crocheting did not last very long. And I came back from a therapy appointment and saw that I still had those craft paints and brushes in a bag in a corner of my room. And I pulled them out and, I just started playing around with paint. Using my fingers mostly to push the paint around on these little canvas boards. But yeah, I just remember in those moments feeling the paint on my fingers and pushing it around and kind of just getting lost in that. And I remember how quiet my mind became. And that was the start of my experience with using art as therapy.
I read an interview that you did with an online magazine called Mother Maker. And in it, you said, I want my kids to see their mom not just surviving motherhood or surviving her life, but living it and thriving and pursuing it. And I really loved this. And I'm curious to hear your reflection on what you wish you could go back and tell your earlier self about your experience now, the self where this type of thriving may have been hard to envision for you. What do you wish that she could hear?
Oh man, I just started feeling tears. That was unexpected. I would go back and tell her that it's not her fault. And I would tell her that she's not a failure, and that struggling with your mental health, whether it's postpartum or in general, is not any kind of a moral failure. And I would just tell her to just give herself way more grace. And honestly, too, I would really just hold her and just sit with her. Because I remember just feeling very alone back then.
Grief and love often go hand in hand in postpartum life. This is how the founder of Pregnancy and Postpartum Athleticism, Brianna Battles, put it.
For a lot of postpartum athletes in particular, there is a mourning and a grieving of an identity that no longer exists. And again, this is a common theme for all postpartum people, not just someone who identifies as an athlete, where there's been significant change in routine, in abilities, in aesthetics, and in, what we have typically found our self-worth and outlets in.
We also heard how challenging it can be to run into problems with things you think are supposed to be intuitive, like nursing and feeding.
Before giving birth, I remember scheduling a home visit with a lactation consultant. She came to our home the day after arriving back from the hospital. By the time she arrived, my nipples were cracked and bleeding. She helped me figure out how to get a proper latch, and I think that completely saved me and made the breastfeeding experience possible for me.
I had very little milk supply at first, and he struggled to latch and nurse for me. 2 weeks postpartum, I still had very little milk supply, and the doctors started to be concerned that I might still have retained placenta, and so I underwent a D&C procedure. Many people think these are just done as an abortion or if you have a retained miscarriage, but I found out that they can also be done after you have a baby. But at 16 months postpartum, I'm happy to report that we have the most positive nurturing relationship we've had so far right now, and thanks to the support of my partner and my family and Zoloft, I'm doing great.
That was Kate and Anna. Navigating the challenges of lactation was part of Shannon Purdy Jones' story, and one contributing factor to her postpartum mental health experience after having a traumatic birth.
I don't actually really remember the first time I really tried to breastfeed our son. The combination of the blood loss, the first couple times trying, I was really out of it, and so we didn't realize we weren't getting a good latch. All of these factors kind of combined to the effect that my breast milk never completely came in. I had planned from day one to body feed and, had been planning for that and reading up on it. And so having my body kind of betray me in that way was not something I anticipated at all.
We first learned about Shannon and her husband Darren's story through our producer Audrey, who works with Shannon at Scuppernong Books in Greensboro. Shannon shared that lactation consultants recommended that they try triple feeding, a process where you chest feed, pump, then feed your baby the pumped milk. It didn't go well.
I didn't sleep for the first couple months of our son's life. I was either feeding him, pumping, feeding him, what had been pumped, or then, by the time you finish that process, it's time to feed them again from the breast, and then you're back restarting this process.
And it's such a catch-22 because sleep deprivation and the stress impacts your milk supply. And so you're kind of like fighting yourself and fighting this cycle, and also fighting the messaging that, you know that there are a lot of health benefits to body feeding, but you're also coming up against kind of real, obstacles in taking care of your own mental health if you continue to do this. So Darren, tell me about kind of the breaking point and how you all decided to stop trying to body feed and try formula.
It was probably 2 or 3 months in. We were feeling, I think, very fatigued and overwhelmed at that point. And like we just couldn't do it anymore. We had seen, like Shannon said, a number of lactation consultants, both through the hospital, through our pediatrician. And finally, the last one we saw was like, look, you keep hearing breast is best. Well, fed is best. And in the office, she made a point to have us feed our son and kind of get through this mental barrier, a bottle of formula. That kicked off another series of events, and that we found out my son had an allergy. So there was another, 30 or 45 days of not knowing what was going on, and a lot of tummy troubles, a lot of, doing circles around our house with the baby on my shoulder, trying to comfort him with an upset stomach. And so even, we felt like we get over one hurdle and then face another, and that was really challenging for both of us.
And this is why I wanted to talk to a couple like Shannon and Darren. When you're juggling so much, how do you keep a relationship together and meet both partners' mental health needs? What does it mean for intimacy and sex?
I really had very low sex drive in my postpartum period. I think I just felt so touched out from spending all day either pumping or actually feeding an infant that I didn't feel drawn to that sexual connection anymore. That part of our relationship has grown and cultivated again, but has taken time and effort to sort of reconnect to my body and mind in that space, and same for my partner.
Trying to adjust to my new identity as a mom and hold on to my identity as a sexual being at times felt super impossible. What made it worse was older women in my family making me feel guilty for not having sex with my partner. They totally ignored my emotional and physical needs during the postpartum period and were prioritizing only my partner's sexual needs.
That was my sister, Priyanka Rao, and listener, Kaisha Jennings. Here are Darren and Shannon's thoughts.
The biggest thing for us, I think, was making sure that we stayed close to each other in terms of communication, make sure we continued to talk to each other. I was thankful that, throughout this whole period with the birth of my son, we were able to still have some physical intimacy in terms of like touching each other, sleeping in the same bed as one another, supporting each other in that way, even if we weren't having sexual intercourse. And so that was still helpful for me as a partner to kind of get that sense of touch and intimacy from my wife. But, there's this long period of healing physically and healing mentally that had to happen before I think we were ready to kind of take that next step.
The biggest thing for me was the mental shift, because obviously you have that 6 to 8 week physical healing time that has to happen before, any kind of vaginal intercourse can happen. But for me, it was like feeling like I was back in myself mentally, because, I was struggling so much with like having like feel sense of inadequacy from not being able to feed my baby and not sleeping, and like all of that just led to me feeling like I was this inadequate person because I couldn't do these things. And so really for me, it was figuring out the feeding issues and figuring out kind of, that it was okay that I couldn't do those things and that I wasn't inadequate for that really was what had to happen for me before I wanted any kind of like sexual physical intimacy.
And there's, that direct correlation between the experience feeding and your ability to sleep if you are having postpartum anxiety, or even if you're not, just worrying about that. We heard from a listener named Elise about that experience. Let's listen.
If you think about it, sleep deprivation is a form of torture. And when you are sleeping 1 hour at a time, a few times a night, it is impossible to cope with anything, let alone the biggest transition of your entire life. The whole sleep when the baby sleeps is one of the most deceptive statements. First, you are having safe sleep content thrown at you from every direction, and that safe sleep does not include the baby sleeping on your chest during your own nap. So when you have a baby that only sleeps while being held, and you have severe anxiety that something bad will happen to your baby because they're not in that safe sleeping environment, there's really absolutely no chance a mother will be able to sleep when the baby sleeps. I had a birth that I really needed to process because it did not go as I hoped, and those thoughts ran on repeat every time I closed my eyes. Add sleep deprivation to the roller coaster of hormones and breastfeeding struggles, and you have a recipe for that postpartum anxiety and depression.
So, Shannon, hearing that, I'm curious about what resonates and what the effect of that lack of sleep and that connection to anxiety was on your relationship with Darren.
Darren was a really supportive partner to go through this process with. But even then, you do end up feeling, even with an incredibly supportive partner, you do end up struggling a little bit with some feelings of resentment if you're the birthing partner, because even though he was up and, changing diapers and like helping me with whatever I needed, like it was still, none of this was happening to him. It was all happening to my body. Like the feeding struggles, were coming from my body. And that wasn't something he could do or take on or had, on him. And so even though he was like this incredibly supportive, wonderful partner to go through this experience with, I still was like, yeah, but it's not you, it's me that this is happening to.
Totally. And even the most supportive partners, they can't take on some aspects of it. And that leads to mental health concerns of their own, which is what we heard from a listener named Nick. Let's listen.
What surprised me most was how subtle the feelings were. Feeling anxious, tired, depressed. I feel like I was so busy looking for those signs in my partner that I never quite considered how they were affecting me. As for care, I was really good at encouraging my partner to seek the care that she needed for everything regarding postpartum, whether that was just taking the baby so that she had time to go to the gym or take a walk or just have a breather to herself. I would say part of the issue is trying to make sure that I am cared for in that same way from myself, by myself. I was in therapy. I'm looking to start it again. There was a simple question of whether or not there's even an hour in a day to carve out for that on top of everything else.
So, Darren, tell me about your own mental health needs in that postpartum period and how you were processing those.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a lot of fatigue and anxiety. The first couple weeks is a bit of a whirlwind, and I think I wish I had more memories because I just felt so tired all the time. And there was a bit of kind of separation from what was happening, and just kind of going through the motions and trying to get it done. If you're up every hour with your partner in the middle of the night trying to feed, you try to be supportive, try to be there. But, I felt at times like a robot. And so, that's really challenging. I think more than anything, what helped me get through that was just time and starting to see improvement, both in our child and in my partner, made a world of difference to me, and I think that helped kind of keep me going and push me along.
So for you all, kind of knowing that the stress that can happen with sleep deprivation and how that kind of limits your ability to connect, I'm curious about any ways that you kind of instituted to reconnect with each other or have moments together, given that your new parenting experience was going to be now parenting two kids. What did you all do to prepare for that, whether that was within your relationship or reaching out for external support?
We had a good support structure in place. both of our mothers were very supportive, and Shannon's mother lives nearby, and she was wonderful in that process in giving us some space or allowing us to take some space for ourselves. That was really helpful. Other than that, I just keep reiterating, we try to talk through what was going on, what issues we're having, what fears each of us are having with the situation, and how we can help support each other. I think that was the most important thing.
From early on in our relationship, we were very fortunate before we got married that we decided to go to like a couple's premarital counseling with a licensed therapist. And that, like, in our entire relationship, not just navigating the postpartum process both times, has made such a huge difference for us in our relationship. And if people have the means, like, I would definitely recommend doing that with any partner you're serious with, because it just, the ability to communicate effectively and express each of our needs to each other, it really, could have potentially saved our relationship going through this process.
A skill to add to our embodied life hacks: communication, communication, communication. Shannon and Darren did have a second kid, and that time around sought out professionals to talk to about their fears of traumatic delivery and feeding. Shannon's experience underlines the need for a better approach to the postpartum period from all systems involved: healthcare, childcare, and workplace support. In the absence of systemic support for postpartum folks, family and friends try to fill the gaps, and some support is more helpful than others. Shannon remembers exactly what she needed from friends to ease her mental load.
If you're going to go over to somebody's house when they're immediately postpartum, don't go expecting them to like entertain you and you just ooh and ah and coo over the baby. Like, seriously, if what they need is to sit and breastfeed on the couch while you do the dishes, that's what you should do. You should go into that experience expressing to them, I am here to give you what you need. So you should go in telling them, like, look, do you need to unload about the ugly parts of this? Like, that's something I always tell, like, any friend of mine that I know is like trying to get pregnant or is pregnant and get ready to have a baby. I said, I will tell them early on in their pregnancy, hey, like, I am a safe person for you to come complain to. Like, kind of joking, but kind of not, because people in society, we have this thing about like only focusing on the good parts, like it's a gift, it's a blessing, it's like these moments you'll cherish forever. I'm like, yeah, it is all those things, but it's also really, really hard. Being pregnant is hard. Being immediately postpartum with a new baby for the first time is really hard. So if you can be that friend that says, hey, it's okay for you to complain and talk to me about the ugly stuff, like that can go a long way to giving someone permission to then say, I'm not okay, I need some help.
For other parents going through this, here's Shannon's advice.
Be easy on yourself. It's okay if everything is not perfect. It is okay if you try your hardest to body feed and can't. Like, it is okay to give that baby a bottle. It is okay to reach out to people in your life like I did to my mom and say, I need help. I haven't slept in weeks. It is all right to cut yourself some slack.
Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC, a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast and WUNC's other shows on demand, consider a contribution at WUNC.org now. Incredible storytelling like you hear on Embodied is only possible because of listeners like you. This episode was produced by Kaya Finlay and Audrey Smith. Amanda Magnus is our editor, Jenny Lawson, our sound engineer, and Quilla wrote our theme music. If you enjoyed this show, check out the first part of this series on the physical aspects of postpartum, and send the episode to a couple friends who you think would like to hear them. Thanks so much to everyone who contributed their thoughts and experiences to this show and the whole series. Jamie, Amanda, Kaisha, Taylor, Elise, Brianna, Nick, Priyanka, Kate, and Bibi. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Anita Rao, taking on the taboo with you.